In this lecture, we will begin learning about Impressionism and the early 20th century background and characteristics. Impressionism was a French movement developed by painters focusing on play of light and color. Impressionism as a French movement in painting is represented by Claude Monet's impression, Sun Rising. Here, the painter captures changes in appearances of light and color. Sound paintings created by composers such as Claude Debussy incorporated parallel movement of chords, exotic scales, and tone colors, as well as fluid rhythms to evoke the Impressionist spirit. While music of the Romantic period was considered Germanic, the music of Impressionism was considered very French. Impressionism in music is characterized by technical innovation, mirroring that used in painting and literature. Techniques include usage of modal and exotic scales, frequent unresolved dissonances, parallel chords, colorful orchestration, and free rhythm. Impressionists turned away from large forms and preferred short lyric forms, such as preludes, nocturnes, and arabesques. Claude Debussy invented a harmonic technique whereby the performer would keep his or her hand in the same position and play the same chord structure while moving up or down the keyboard. This technique was called parallelism or planing. The use of the whole tone scale, a scale with no half steps, unlike the major and minor scales, produced a hazy, languid atmosphere for the listener. Listen to the impressionistic examples on this slide. Claude Debussy was a French impressionist composer that linked the Romantic and 20th century. A talented rebel at the Paris Conservatory, Debussy won the Prix de Rome, which paid for 3 years of study in Rome. After 2 years, he returned to Paris because he couldn't find musical inspiration when away. Debussy's music was influenced by his visits to Russia, Asian music performed at the Paris International Exposition of 1889, and the music of Richard Wagner. Though he composed important works, he was relatively unknown to the public and taught piano to earn a living until his opera Pelléas and Mélisande in 1902. It was well received by the public, and he was recognized as the most important living French composer. Debussy was also well known for Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, which was written as a symphonic poem and later turned into a ballet. Debussy's free and spontaneous sound evoked fleeting moods and misty atmosphere. He was often inspired by literary and pictorial ideas. His stress on tone color, atmosphere, and fluidity is characteristic of Impressionism in music. Brief, frequent solos are used more often than the massive sound of a full orchestra. Debussy's treatment of harmony was a revolutionary aspect of musical Impressionism. He uses chords more for their special color than for its function in a harmonic progression. He not only used traditional 3- and 4-note chords, but also 5-note chords with a rich sound. Debussy weakened tonality, but he never completely abandons it. His music also has a rhythmic flexibility that reflects the fluid and accented quality of the French language. His output is quite varied. 55 art songs set to symbolist poems, 1 opera, and numerous works for piano, orchestra, and chamber ensembles. Listen to Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. Post-Impressionism was a desire or need to return to more order and clarity of organization and basic concepts of form. Maurice Ravel was a post-impressionist French composer of Swiss Basque descent. He was fascinated with the music of Spain, which can be heard in the 2 listenings shown here, Ravel's Bolero and Rhapsody Espagnole. The following are just some of the things that occurred during the 20th century. Freud's interpretation of dreams was published in 1900. The Wright brothers had their first powered flight in 1903. Einstein's special theory of relativity was in 1905. The First World War occurred from 1914 to 1918. The Great Depression began in 1929. The Second World War was from 1939 to 1945. The atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima in 1945. The Korean War was from 1950 to 1953. The structure of DNA was discovered in 1953. The Vietnam War was 1955 to 1975. During that time, President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. American astronauts landed on the moon in 1969, and then there was the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The early 20th century was a time of revolt within all of the arts. More fundamental changes occurred in music after 1900 than at any time since the beginning of the Baroque period. Composers took new approaches to pitch, rhythm, and sound. The new approaches were so radical to some listeners that they were met with violent hostility. The most famous music riot in music history occurred on May 29, 1913, in Paris at the premiere of Igor Stravinsky's ballet, The Rite of Spring. Police had to be called in to remove hecklers and break up fights in the audience. The audience was reacting to the great transformations occurring in the music. The chords, rhythms, and sounds that so baffled the crowd in 1913 are now commonly heard in jazz, rock, and music for movies and television. Before 1900, music was structured by fundamental techniques and general principles. But after 1900, music has not been governed by a single system for organizing pitch. 20th century music does not rely on pre-established relationships and expectations, but on musical cues within a composition. The new approach to sound helps make 20th century music fascinating when listened to with an open mind. The characteristics of 20th century music are tone color. It became more important in creating variety, continuity, and mood. Noise-like and percussive sounds are used more often. Percussion instruments became more prominent. Orchestral and chamber work sound transparent because individual tone colors are heard clearly. In harmony, consonance and dissonance, a traditional distinction between the two was abandoned. No general principle determines whether a chord is stable or not. There were new chord structures. The triad is no longer the fundamental chord. Terms to know are polychords, fourth chords, and tone clusters. There were also alternatives to the traditional tonal system. Traditional techniques are modified. For example, a composition may have a central tone, but other elements, like the tonic triad, central major or minor scale, or dominant tonic relationship are missing. Terms to know in this area are polytonality, bitonality, atonality, and 12-tone system. Rhythm was also organized in new ways by increased emphasis on irregularity and unpredictability. It is used to generate power, drive, and excitement, and the new procedures were drawn from sources such as jazz, folk music, etc. Meters change rapidly, beats are grouped irregularly, and the accented beat comes at unequal time intervals in the 20th century. Terms again to know are polyrhythm and ostinato. Finally, melody was no longer tied to traditional chords or major-minor keys. It could freely use a variety of scales or chromatic tones. Wide leaps and rhythmic irregularities make 20th century melodies unpredictable and hard to sing. This is the end of this presentation. Please continue on to the early 20th modernism presentation.